In this section, we'll look at 1968 and also talk about some of the status of the civil rights movement as the year and the decade wound down. Now, given all of the riots of the mid to late 1960s, it's not surprising that Johnson felt he had to do something. And what he did was he appointed a National Commission on Civil Disorders to investigate the causes. And the commission, which was headed by former Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois, cited poverty and racism in America's inner city slums as the main cause. And it said that unless there was an all-out effort to provide adequate housing, jobs, training, education, and welfare, America would continue to sprawl downward towards, it said, quote, two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, unquote. Well, in reaction to the commission's report, Johnson proposed new legislation and new spending on the inner cities. The problem was, however, that the more revolutionary and angry civil rights movement represented by the Black Panthers had created suspicion and animosity between, between the legislators and potential activist allies. By 1968, the riots had begun to encourage a white backlash stressing law and order, and not actually anxious to reward what they saw as the violence. Johnson's bill appeared to have little chance in Congress. Then, in April 1968, the unthinkable happened. Trying to regain the momentum, Martin Luther King began organizing a Poor Person's March on Washington, seeking to unite poor blacks and poor whites for economic justice. As part of this new focus, he traveled to Memphis to support a garbage worker strike. Standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Hotel, standing next to Jesse Jackson, who later took over the nonviolent mantle from King, a bullet rang out, hitting King in the head. A small-town thief and racist, James Earl Ray, was convicted of the murder. He was caught abroad after the murder carrying a false passport. In 1969, he confessed to the assassination and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Ray later attempted to recant his confession, but died in prison of hepatitis C in 1998. The reality that one lone, angry racist could end the life of one of America's greatest leaders was difficult for some King supporters to believe. Like JFK's assassination, conspiracy theories existed for many years. King's murder, the champion of nonviolence, proved the spark that set off the powder keg of America's race relations. News of King's murder provoked 168 race riots in cities across the land. The worst rioting occurred in the nation's capital, where literally black clouds of smoke covered the U.S. Capitol. Soldiers manned machine guns on the Capitol steps. While black national leaders and politicians across the spectrum mourned King's death, the assassination made him a martyr to the cause of nonviolent protest for justice. It assured King a status as an American political icon. In 2011, a statue of King was unveiled just off the Capitol Mall in Washington. The momentary grief and unity that follows King's assassination helped pass Johnson's proposed civil rights legislation, much like the earlier assassination of JFK had made the Civil Rights Act of 1964 possible. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in the sale or rental of most private housing and applied to 80% of the nation's dwelling units. Significantly, it also banned racial discrimination in the selection of jurors. Finally, the Act added specific protections for those working on behalf of civil rights. By the late 1960s, the civil rights movement was almost 2 decades old, now commonly referred to as the Second Reconstruction, alluding to the period immediately following the Civil War and officially ending slavery. The success of the movement was as obvious as its failures. In one sense, African Americans were now as visible in many professions as the whites. Athletes like basketball's Wilt Chamberlain or Chicago Bears football running back Gale Sayers were national heroes. Many African Americans had accumulated considerable wealth. In the entertainment industry, there were national treasures like comedian Flip Wilson, actor Sidney Poitier, shown here holding an Oscar, and entertainer Sammy Davis Jr., part of the famous Rat Pack. The number of black politicians and white-collar workers continued to grow, as did a black middle class. As mentioned previously, Johnson appointed the lead Brown case plaintiff lawyer Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court. Looking a bit ahead, in 1972, an African-American woman, and thus someone with obviously 2 strikes against them, both a woman and an African-American, launched a campaign for the presidency. While there's little real chance of Shirley Chisholm winning the Democratic nomination, the fact that she was actually taken seriously demonstrated the advances the movement for African American civil rights had achieved. Of course, despite the notable successes, the reality remained that the vast majority of African Americans still faced economic and social conditions not easily corrected by legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Moreover, the riots, and in a larger sense Johnson's Great Society spending on poor blacks, had led to an inevitable counter-reaction among many conservative whites. In the 1968 presidential election, Alabama's Governor George Wallace sought to garner this conservative white anger by running as a third-party candidate, leaving the Democratic Party, which was pretty much now associated with the liberals' embrace of civil rights. Wallace ended up winning 5 Deep South states, but didn't prevent the election of Republican Richard Nixon. Nixon, recognizing that Southern conservatives were angry at the Democratic Party's embrace of black civil rights, sought to win over the disaffected Southern conservative white Democrats. Nixon spoke in 1968 of the silent majority, who were hard-working and disdainful of the social unrest, and of the need for, quote, law and order, a clear reaction to the racial riots. Political pundits called this Nixon's Southern strategy, another important step in the eventual Republican takeover of the South. Lyndon Johnson, by the way, had remarked that upon signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of the mid-1960s, that they've handed the South to the Republican Party for at least a generation. That would eventually prove correct. This concludes the section on 1968 and sort of with the status of the civil rights movement at that point.